me tell you something. What a mess sin makes. What a mess sin makes in our lives. Because sin begets sin begets sin. It's like in James 1, it puts it like this. Every person is tempted, is given opportunity when they are dragged away by their own evil desire that's inside and enticed by the temptation. And then after they've given into the temptation, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, actually going through with it. And sin, when it is full grown, it gives birth to death and destructive. It's kind of like this, this right here. It's like there we have, he describes this vicious cycle of evil desires. You know, evil desires that are inside, jealousy and rage and malice and pride and lust and all these things that are inside. But they lead us then to, there's temptations, opportunities, circumstances where we are tempted to take our evil desires that we have inside and put them into an outward, there's an outward opportunity. That's what a temptation is. A temptation, a circumstance, or an opportunity to act on that evil desire. And then that, James says, really leads to actually acting on it. And we have sin. Sin, the actual act of going through with our desires in an actual place and an actual time. And we sin. We give in to the temptation. And then, but given enough time, sin begets sin, and it decays and it destroys. He says there's this just death. Death keeps on growing and growing into death. And you get this cycle where you've got his first mess happens because he's got evil desires and he has opportunity, and then he makes opportunity happen into sin, and then it becomes consequences and it's destructive, and then it kind of leads back into he's got a desire for something else. Okay, I have a desire to cover it up, and then he does, and then and so it's this vicious cycle that James actually tells us about. This is the mess that sin makes in our lives. And God's heart is that we would maybe it would be here, maybe it's when there's a temptation, maybe it's at the sin or after the sin, or maybe it's after we finally come down to, where the life's just fallen apart and it's become totally destructive in our lives. At some point, God says the best thing that you can do, you've got to be able to stop the mess. Stop the mess. The messes that David made were pretty big. And he didn't catch himself until he finally got caught. But even then, he made the best move ever. He finally came clean and asked forgiveness. I love those words in verse 1. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love and your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Do you know what blotting is? It's often defined as erasing, but it was more than just erasing. It was really covering one thing with something else. One liquid covered by a greater liquid that drowns it out, or one ink blot covered with a greater ink blot and scratched out and over so you don't see the original, or one stain covered with a greater stain. Loving and compassionate God, please blot out the real mess of my sin, the real stain of my sin. And the cool thing is that God can blot out my sin. And God does blot out my sin. Because at just the right time, God shed his blood to forgive my sin, to cover over my sin. And to cover it completely. But also when he died on the cross. Not only did he die to forgive me of my sins, but also he put his Spirit in me. And more that Spirit covers over more and more my evil desires, replacing them with a desire to please him. And his Spirit in me, Jesus even prays it. He says it leads us away from our temptations. He covers our temptations that lead to our sin. And our ultimate foe of death is finally covered up through what he did. On the cross, he beat death. He conquered sin. He blots out our sin. Gives us his Spirit through what he did on the cross. The bloody mess of the cross ends up covering the bloody stain of my sin. And the bloody mess of my sin that's dirty and it's gross and it's disgusting is covered up in the beauty of the cross and the blood that was shed there. And although in that moment it looked like this cruel, ugly, disgusting thing, but it ends up being the beautiful thing that covers over the greatest of messes that we make.